Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. This week, we will be discussing Russia-phobia, the new Cold War. It's incredible to witness. I remember when everyone laughed at Mitt Romney, rightly so, for saying Russia was the biggest threat to the US in his 2012 debates with Barack Obama. Obama quipped, "The 1980s called and they want their foreign policy back." The Democrats ridiculed the Republican candidate for thinking Russia was a foe. Obama and Medvedyev even exchanged friendly secrets accidentally caught on a hot mic. But now, Putin is one of the most hated and demonized persons in the world. Surely, we can all point to the US Democrats' desperation trying to explain Hillary's loss to Trump in 2016. But for this conspiracy theory to have taken such a deep and wide hold in American and more broadly Western society demonstrates that there is something much deeper that they're tapping into. What does this mean for international relations now? Global peace? Global war? Is Russia an aggressive world power seeking to undermine democracies as the cartoonish Western press seems to indicate? What is the basis of the hostility? To explore this question, I am honored to have Andrei Raevsky, who blogs as The Saker, as my guest. I could not have a more qualified and insightful person to speak to on this issue. The Saker is a military analyst with a very important website, The Vineyard of the Saker. He is one of the most important and respected analysts in the alternative media, and his articles are featured on a wide number of sites. His website reportedly got 50,000 page views per day from August to September 2014. I'm very fortunate to have him on this show to help us understand the so-called Russia question. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor.
Yes, I know you've been experiencing some health issues, and I hope you're feeling much better.
I am indeed. Thank you.
Good. Well, thanks for taking the time to speak on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I wanted to start off by, I guess, asking a little sort of personal question in a sense about your background. You're a Russian American, is that correct?
No, not quite. I am a pure product of the Cold War, if you want.
Mm-hmm.
I was born in Switzerland in a family of Russian refugees who had left Russia after the Civil War. So that would make me a fourth generation Russian. I never had a Soviet or Russian passport, and nobody in my family ever had. So our family roots go back to Imperial Russia, if you want. But I did study in the United States, and I lived in this country for over 20 years now.
Right. Okay. So you migrated to the States as a student, is that right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, I lived most of my life in Switzerland, and then I moved to the United States, and I got 2 degrees here in U.S. colleges before moving back to Switzerland for a while, where I worked in different places, including the UN and the Swiss military, and then I came back here to the United States.
Right. Were you, the information that you could find on the web says that you were a NATO analyst, is that correct?
Absolutely false. I never had I never worked for NATO. No, I was an analyst for the Swiss intelligence service.
Okay.
The Swiss military intelligence service, where I worked as an analyst, and I never worked for any NATO structure.
Right. Okay, yeah. Because I wasn't sure about the extent of your American background or even your Russian background as well. And I mean, one thing about the Russians in America, you don't hear much. I think the biggest thing that hit popular culture was probably The Deer Hunter, right? If you know that film. You know the film?
Yeah, I do know it. Yeah, I do.
Yeah, that was, and when I saw it, that struck me about, particularly, about the role of the Orthodox Church in the Russian American diaspora, I suppose, and that was really interesting. But I don't think I've really seen anything else in terms of the Russian diaspora in America. Are there many Russians in America?
Yes, very, very much. And there are many because they're completely different. I mean, we speak of waves. So there was this first wave, which was the Civil War wave, which I am a descendant of.
Right.
Then there's the second wave during World War II. Many, many, many Russians were either deported or fled or by whatever reason ended up being in the United States. Then there's a third wave, which was the Soviet Jews. And in Russia, really, Jew is more than a religion. It's a nationality.
Yeah.
So they were quite distinct from, say, non-Jewish Russians.
Right.
And that was the big wave of Russian Jews. And then there was a fourth wave, which was the huge brain drain that happened in the 90s.
Right.
When basically Russia was almost finished. I mean, I think Russia was at an edge of total and complete collapse.
That's right.
So a lot of people immigrated. And then there's another wave now. And that fourth wave was a mix of Jews and non-Jews. And then there's another wave. There's the mobsters.
Yeah.
Who basically came during pretty much at the same time, during the third wave and part of the fourth wave. The fourth wave was mostly people with high academic or scientific credentials. I mean, Silicon Valley is full of them.
Right.
And you could say there's a fifth wave of Russians moving back and forth now between the US and Russia. A lot of people have gone back. A lot of people have left. So there's more of so we say a circular or a two-way immigration now. No, it's full of Russians.
And
it's like San Francisco, New York, or Miami. There's a lot of Russians here.
Yeah. So I mean, so in a sense, it's like in popular culture, they've been underrepresented in a lot of ways, wouldn't you say? In American popular culture, because as I said, I can only point to the deer hunter. But on the other hand, Russian Jews are another thing, because I think in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, ABC, CBS, and NBC, they were owned by 3 Russian Jews who were probably even related or from the same shtetl or something like that, if I'm not mistaken.
I wasn't aware of that, but we all know the example of Google, obviously. Yeah,
yeah. But I'm pretty sure that ABC, NBC, and CBS in the 50s and 60s were owned by Russian Jews. Yeah.
Okay, but this probably then, that's my guess now.
Yeah.
We're probably talking about Jews who came to the United States before or right after the Soviet Revolution. Because there was a big immigration of Jews in the late 19th, early 20th century. And then what is usually not known, people mostly now realize that a lot of Bolsheviks were Jews. But what they don't know is that a majority of Bolsheviks being Jews does not mean that a majority of Jews are Bolsheviks.
Yes, yes.
And a lot of Jews also fled. And some of the worst pogroms, for instance, in the Ukraine, were actually done by Red Army units or by revolutionary units.
Well, I mean,
so there was also many Jews left in the early years of the revolution.
Yeah, and I mean, and that's the other thing, that the Trotskyist element, and Leon Trotsky himself, and the neocons, because the neocons are now pushing this war with Russia, kind of have this old link to the Civil War and Russia. So there seems to be, some historical memory or reckoning or unfinished business occurring there.
You're touching on a crucial element here, because it is true that a lot of Jews who left still Imperial Russia had a profound resentment against the imperial government, the Russian Orthodox Church, and a lot of them really didn't think too well of the Russian non-Jewish people. And then, as you mentioned, it's absolutely crucial to understand that the Trotsky thing.
Yeah.
Because to the extent that it is accurate that the early generation Bolsheviks were largely coming out of Jews, Stalin changed that.
Yeah.
But one crucial thing I want to explain here is some people say that Stalin was, anti-Jewish. That's nonsense. What he did, he basically replaced the dictatorship of the party by more of his own personal power, and he switched cadres.
Right.
Because he did very different. You need one kind of cadre for, a revolution, and a completely different one to defend your country against a potential war, which was brewing in Germany. So basically, and there was a purge of the party. Now, a party that's mostly Jewish, you can't purge it without hitting Jews.
Yeah.
Therefore, a lot of them indeed were linked to Trotsky and what he represented, and a lot of them also resented now the Soviet Russia for basically, as they would say it, repressing them.
Yeah.
forgetting that they were the ones who repressed. The people who were repressed are the first generation of repressors.
Yeah, and then to add another layer of complication onto the whole thing, with the establishment of the state of Israel, Soviet Russia was a big, was perhaps a premier ally, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, on Stalin himself. Yeah.
Well, remember that Israel originally was seen mostly as a secular and socialist country.
Yeah.
If you look at the early generation of
kibbutz,
etc., these were people who were very, very pro-Soviet, really, and they were not at all as anti-Soviet as one might think. And their ideology was much more compatible with the Soviet official ideology than the religious Zionist, racist ideology that came later, and then the way Israel dealt with its Arab neighbors, who were also allied for anti-colonial reasons to the Soviet Union. That added a layer of hostility. So basically, from being a pro-Israeli country, the Soviet Union became pretty rapidly the main supporter of Arab countries.
Yeah, that was about around 73, I suppose, around the Arab, and 67, I guess.
All of it, yeah.
Started, yeah. And so, I mean, and there's another aspect about, I want to just explore a little before we start about the suppressed Russian-American relations. I think that's kind of the theme I'm starting off with. Is like, I remember also, I talked about Mitt Romney in my introduction, but Sarah Palin, they made fun of Sarah Palin too, when she talked about being in Alaska and being able to see Russia, and then Saturday Night Live distorted it, and people think that's the reality, that she said she could see it from her house. But Alaska used to be called Russian America. Most Americans don't even know that. It was Russian America.
So was a good chunk of California.
Oh, I didn't realize about California as well.
Although I should correct myself. Alaska was actually part of the Russian Empire, whereas this is in California. This was never Russian territory, but Russians were present there.
Right, yeah.
But as far as I remember, maybe I'm off here, and I'm glad to be corrected if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure that Russia never claimed any territory in the state of Alaska itself. Only a presence of traders.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe I have maps of Alaska being called Russia America, and I believe that the purchase was around the time of the Louisiana Purchase, I think.
If I remember correctly, yes.
Yeah, when they purchased Russian America, but Russia had territory. North America was part of its empire, So I mean, all these things that that people have suppressed about the relations. I just find it interesting. Even my understanding is that because of that, North America, or the Americas as a whole, in terms of Orthodox Christianity, falls under the Russian Orthodox authority. How for listeners who don't know, the way the Orthodox Church is that you have your Serbian, your Greek Orthodox, your Syrian, your Armenian, and it's not theological splits. These are administrative national splits. And from my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, from my understanding, the Americas really are supposed to fall under the Russian Orthodox Church. Are you aware of that?
Well, it's somewhat more complicated and more controversial. Initially, you're right. For instance, you look at St. Hiram of Alaska and other saints who came. One of the major Russian saints of the 20th century, Saint Tikhon, who was a patriarch after that, wasn't as a missionary in the United States. But U.S. is really a unique case because we're talking about a country of immigrants. Mm-hmm. Normally, the Orthodox Church, by the way, the Orthodox Church condemns the separation based on nationality. It's actually considered a heresy called philitism. You're not supposed to say every single individual ethnic or national group has the right to have its own church. But it is true that historically, the churches correspond to specific administrative or political borders. But in the case of the U.S., it's fundamentally different because it's a country primarily of immigrants. So the Greeks brought their own clergy with them, the Russians brought their clergy with them, and so did everybody else.
Right.
So for a while, it's true that the predominant Russian Orthodox Church was a Russian Orthodox Church in exile, actually, in the United States. It was exiles of the same first emigration I come from.
Okay, right.
But eventually, a movement split off, said that they wanted to have a purely American Orthodox Church.
Right.
And there's nothing wrong with the concept, by the way. I mean, the way they went about it is a different topic, but the concept fundamentally is a sound one.
Yeah.
For instance, there shouldn't be two bishops in the same diocese.
Yes.
And we have a situation where we can have 3 or 4 bishops in the same.
Armenian, Greek,
Exactly.
Russian. Yeah.
So there was an attempt to create, and it exists today, still something called the Orthodox Church of America, or OCA, which sees its mission as being the Orthodox Church of America and not an ethnically based one. And it's coming to that because the more the United States will be a country of people, of local people, of people born in the United States and not freshly immigrants, the more the national division is going to not make sense. And for instance, in my parish, okay, I'm ethnically and culturally, I'm Russian. I belong to a nominally Greek parish in which our priest is Greek, and we have some people of Greek origin, and the rest are Anglos, Russians. It's a complete mix.
Right.
And that ethnic mix you see actually in most parishes, not in the United States. You see very often parishes where ethnically completely mixed, as it should be.
Yeah, and I mean that's what I suppose America is. It's this immigrant melting pot. But yeah, I mean, and I sort of understood that too in a way because because St. Thomas, when he went to India and established the church in Kerala, I believe that the Kerala church was brought under the authority of Syria. So that's why in Kerala in India, the old Christians there who would call themselves Syrian Christians, even though they're not from Syria, it's because they were under. So I sort of understood that sometimes a bishop or an administrative center might control a far-flung region, and that because America did not have a large Orthodox Christian population, that might have been the case, that then the Russian Orthodox Church would have been in charge.
Or another, the situation where it's completely unplanned, when about 1.5 million to 2 million people left Russia after the Civil War, they just immigrated with their own priests, their own bishops, who did abroad what they did at home. They didn't change anything. They just continued. It was not some kind of fundamental decision, we're going to be running, Russian parishes in France or in Argentina or in the United States. It just happened that they emigrated.
Right.
And then local people, regularly, there was a steady flow of converts, which of course, brought the quote-unquote pureness of the Russian element down and added local people. And again, as it should be, there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah. So when you migrated to the States, where were you?
I was in Washington, D.C. I was studying at the American University first, and then at Johns Hopkins has a small school, actually notorious for its neocons graduates.
Yeah.
And I actually have to admit, I got a degree at that school.
Right. So you're blogging and you're writing on Russia. So you were working with the Swiss intelligence, but not with NATO as such.
Yes,
or not NATO at all.
I think I quit in 93 or 94, if I'm not mistaken in my. Pretty much came to an end in 93, 94. So it has been many years now.
Right. So when did you start your blogging?
Well, I started my blogging in 2007 in the United States. I came to the U.S. in 2002. And basically, I had completely lost my career because of my political views. I was considered, politically unreliable and suspicious by first of all, the Swiss authorities and pretty much all the people of influence in that country.
Well, do you want to elaborate on that a bit? I'm intrigued.
Well, what I can say is that 2 things happened, which were, to me, I have to tell you this. I was a true bona fide, hardcore Cold Warrior and anti-Soviet activist.
Okay.
As hardcore as it gets, because I come from a family of white Russians.
Right. And that's an interesting thing in the Deer Hunter too, because the Russian Americans too, they were so strong in their Orthodox faith, and so they hated the communists.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But things got really complicated in 91 because first of all, the Soviet Union collapsed. But then Chechnya happened, and much closer to Switzerland, Croatia, Bosnia happened.
Yeah.
And during those years, I mean, I was reading the Russian press, etc. So I had always contacts in Russia, and I traveled to Russia the first time in my life in '91, right after the coup, literally, before I couldn't go, for obvious reasons. And I was absolutely horrified by the behavior of the West, because I realized very fast that they were backing the Chechen Wahhabis to the hilt. And then I saw what was going on. Even worse was the situation with Croatia and Bosnia.
Yeah.
Because, you know, it's amazing. I mean, you read the media, and then you read classified reports, be it sometimes maybe, you know, government documents, but also I was working at the UN, and I was getting UNPROFOR documents every day. UNPROFOR being the name of the UN force which was supposed to keep the peace.
Okay. And just to be clear, so Switzerland is not part of NATO, correct?
No, officially not. Officially, it's neutral.
Right. So what does that mean in terms of its intelligence? Does it mean it gets both, or it gets none, or what?
That is not something I can discuss.
Okay, sure.
But what I can tell you is this: I can discuss. It's called partnerships. It's not something I'm not can discuss.
Right.
But what I can tell you is this: there was a generation of people when I first got to my position as an analyst. There was truly a generation of people who believed in Swiss neutrality, who were truly saying, we stay out of that.
Right.
That's changed before me. I saw how pro-NATO elements were, you know, getting all the key positions, how the other ones were either purged or leaving. Some of the most brilliant people I met at the time left, were happy to resign. And, you know, I never forget, there was one day we had a meeting of the entire general staff, and one lecturer came in and said in Swiss German, gentlemen, the new buzzword is interoperability with the NATO. You know, that was clear. So It's a fiction. The reality is today Switzerland is a puppet of NATO.
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
and that obviously, I couldn't, I mean, I believed in free speech and being an honest analyst. I openly opposed that on grounds of Swiss neutrality. I also did not think that it was right for the West to support Wahhabis in Chechnya or to break up by force Yugoslavia, and that got me very rapidly blacklisted as a unreliable element.
Okay.
Also, I traveled to the Soviet Union, to just after the fall of the Soviet Union to Russia, and I have to say, speaking with the people there, and including people that are considered as opponents, such as party people, KGB people, I met a lot of them, spoke at length with them, and I have to say that also affected I realized that a lot of my perceptions were fundamentally erroneous. I still am not a communist. I still think that the fall of the communism in Russia was a good thing, but the price paid for it was horrendous, and the attitude of the West was an abomination.
Yeah. And I'm intrigued about your observations on Swiss neutrality as well, because coming from, you know, a third world country, you know, the non-aligned movement defined, that's what the term third world meant. It didn't mean poverty, which is what it meant that you weren't with the West and you weren't with the Soviet bloc. You were supposed to be neutral. And certainly that fell apart too a long time. So it's interesting about the parallels between, you know, the neutrality that was supposed to be there, but which fell apart for various reasons. So that's an interesting thing. So yeah, so that's fascinating. So when you went to the United States, were you involved in doing, you know, military analyst work at all, or?
My first degree was a bachelor's degree in what they called then Soviet studies.
Right.
And within that, I met a wonderful professor, a guy called Jackson Piotrov, who was of Polish origin, a brilliant man, a kind man, a wonderful man. And he gave me the virus of military analysis.
Right.
And so I switched all my courses to as close possible to military topics as I could. And then when I went for my master's degree, it was a double degree in international economics and strategic studies. That was almost practically purely military.
Right.
So my graduate degree is in military analysis, and that became the passion of my life, and that's really what I think defines my education best.
Right. And so your decision to start blogging, did that grow out of earlier independent work you were doing, or what what prompted you to start your independent blogging?
Well, what happened was initially I was so completely disgusted with everything that I didn't blog at all. As a matter of fact, when I came to the United States, I was homeschooling my children, and my wife was a veterinarian and was feeding the entire family.
Right.
She couldn't work in Switzerland, but she could work in the U.S. where she got her degrees because she's like me. She's Russian fourth generation, but born in the United States. Hence, I could get a green card very easily. And when we couldn't find any way I couldn't find any employment. I should say, after I lost my original career, I retrained as a software engineer.
Okay.
And then 9/11 happened, and the entire software IT sector collapsed. At which point I was unemployed again, and I went like, this is too much. So I came to the United States and wanted nothing to do with my past.
Right.
But the French say, chasser le naturel et revient au galop, which means, you try to suppress your natural inclinations and they come right back.
Yeah.
And in 2007, I started blogging just because I wanted to scratch an itch.
Right.
I never tried to be popular. I made zero effort to get any kind of Google ranking or any kind of readership at all.
Mm-hmm.
I just began writing whatever went through my mind. And most of that was linked to the Middle East, actually.
Right.
I'm extremely interested in the movement Hezbollah, which I studied for over a decade now. And I followed the Israeli politics closely. So for me, that was the field of interest. And my blog wasn't really very popular because there was not much of a demand for that. What made it actually visible was the revolution in the Ukraine.
Right.
Because it was a coincidence. I was a person of Russian culture and worldview, but I was writing in English. And as soon as the troubles started, the entire Euromaidan and everything, I knew where this was headed. I said, this is headed for civil war. And I was right, and that actually got me a lot of visibility. And since I'm considered now this Russian blogger who mainly deals with Russia, but really the origins were scratching an itch and dealing with Israel.
Right. Well, that's fascinating, and that's an excellent background for us to get into the substance of the analysis. So I'm interested in looking at things in a very broad historical point of view. I think that everything in the modern world has roots that go centuries back. Mm-hmm. And certainly anything to do with Russia does, I believe. How would you say that, how are we to understand Russia in the broader view of the world, from your opinion? What is the place of Russia in the movement of world history? I don't know how far back you want to go, where you think is important to start, but I'd be interested to know where do you think the starting point should be for us in terms of understanding Russia's place in the world today?
Well, in theology, there's a concept called apophatic theology, which is negative theologies, where you don't say what God is, but you say what he's not. And I will do kind of the same thing. I would say the most important thing to understand is Russia is not the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
Neither is it the Russian Empire. What Russia is today is what I sometimes call New Russia. Sometimes I refer to it as Putin's Russia. Of course, it grew out of the 80s and the 90s. I mean, there are links, obviously. But fundamentally, I think there's a qualitative break. The most important thing is that Russia is absolutely not seeking to be a world power or a second Soviet Union or some kind of anti-USA or any of that. As typically happens with countries who tremendously suffer from their imperial period, there comes a point where people don't want to hear about it anymore. Mm-hmm. And as much as Russians today want to have a strong country, they want to have a big and prosperous country, they don't think of themselves as small and irrelevant. There is no constituency for empire. That's why all the talk about Russia invading Estonia or Poland or even driving to Portugal is absolutely ridiculous. As popular as Putin still is, if he tried something like that, there would be an instant reaction against that. And there was a reaction, even this very small Russian operation in Syria, which was very limited in size. Putin had to put a lot of his personal credibility to explain the rationale for it. And he had to go at length to explain, okay, this is not Czechoslovakia in 68, this is not Afghanistan, this is not an imperial war. We're having a limited function in a case where it's our absolutely crucial national interest. And he tried to bring as many back as possible, because the fact is there's no constituency for empire. That's the first thing.
How did Putin describe the national interest in Syria?
Oh, very simple. He said, if we don't kill them there, we'll have to kill them here.
Right.
Remember that Russia had Chechnya.
Yeah.
And I don't think people in the West measured the true horror of what took place in Chechnya. Yeah. And to summarize it, I would say it's the same thing that hit Syria when Al-Qaeda and the rest of them got there.
Yeah.
They were just as vicious, just as insane, just as animalistic, barbarian. I mean, we're talking about possessed people whose level of viciousness is just hard to describe and hard to imagine.
Yeah.
And the world saw that, you know, with all the executions that were publicized in Syria. But what was going on in Chechnya was the same. It was exactly the same.
Yeah, I remember that was like an issue that catapulted Putin, both domestically and in the world, when he had to deal with that hostage situation in the school, and when he dealt with it decisively. You know, that you know, when he ended the Chechen conflict, in other words, more or less.
Yes. Because in the school, there wasn't an order. That's a myth, actually. It was an explosion occurred, and parents rushed in to save their kids. And that's when the special forces rushed in to protect the parents and do their best. And I think they took 5 or 6 dead, which is unheard of for an anti-terrorist operation. That was not planned at all. They just, I mean, some of the special forces literally protected people with their bodies.
Right.
So that was not planned. But yes, he did decide, he really did say, this is intolerable and we have to stop what happened in Chechnya.
Yeah.
And so for the Russians, you know, that memory is still vivid. And when they realized it's the same people, and actually his analysis is true, if they had taken over Syria, Iran would be next and Russia would be next.
That's right, because in Al-Qaeda, I can't remember one of the leaders, they call him the Russian, and he has this orange beard. I can't remember his name now. But yeah. And
there are many.
Yeah. And, you know, I'll tell you, for me, I started to understand this more. I was doing some research on the self-accession, the issue with Georgia and whatnot. And so I was writing a paper on it. And as I started to read more and read the EU reports, and I realized, I just realized the lies, the outright lies that the Western media would say, even after the EU report exonerated Russia and you know, showed how Saakashvili and in Georgia, I mean, they were just crazy, and they were trying to bring the West into a confrontation, and then how that goes back to the whole NATO didn't disband after the Warsaw Pact disbanded, and then started to encircle Russia, and it was, and the NATO Russia Council, you know, disappeared, and it was just a whole, you know, series of bad faith moves, just constantly from the 90s, whether it be through Yeltsin, you know, was a tool in that case, and Putin was kind of like the spanner in the works, the spoke in the wheel. He stopped that whole planned disintegration process, and
yes.
Yeah, and I realized that, and from then I said, wow, I really more understood what the dynamic was and how propagandized people are in the West about this whole thing.
Oh yeah, and keep in mind that, for instance, even after, and I think it's really crucial to stress the fundamental and crucial role played by Ramzan Kadyrov and his father, Ahmad Haji Kadyrov. And the Chechens liberated their own country with Russian help, but they also played a crucial central role, particularly in denouncing the kind of fake Islam that was, you know, peddled by the Saudis and all the Al-Qaeda affiliates. But even after Kadyrov and Putin managed to bring peace back to Chechnya, Takfiri terrorism still continued in neighboring Dagestan.
Right.
And a lot of Muslims have been killed in Russia in defense of traditional Islam, killed by the Takfiris. So in Russia, there's an acute awareness, on one hand, that not all Muslims are, you know, Al-Qaeda types. For Russians, they're neighbors. You know, they lived with them centuries next. They know that they come in all sorts of flavor and colors like any other religion or group. And at the same time, there's this true loathing, hatred for the Al-Qaeda types.
Yeah,
the program there, the program there is very simple. We'll kill them all. I mean, that's Putin's policy towards them. Either you stop or we'll kill you.
Yeah.
And he said it very officially, actually said it once using pretty crude language. He actually said once that he would off them off even if he finds them in restrooms, you know.
Yeah.
That was the kind of language he used. And the message was sent that we will crush you. And the Chechens themselves, when they speak of the Wahhabi types, they use the word shaitan, which means devils.
Yes.
You know, because so it wasn't too hard a sell for him as soon as it was clear that Syria was about to fall to the same kind of people,
right.
and that the end goal clearly was Iran and Russia.
Yeah, because I mean, even in terms of understanding from the fall of the Soviet Union, I mean, you can tell me if I understand this correctly, if my understanding is accurate or not. But you know, after the fall of the Soviet Union, and you know, the Warsaw Pact dissolved, and NATO was supposed to be dissolved, and it wasn't. And then you had the whole Bosnia and breakup of Yugoslavia, Kosovo issue. So you had all these betrayals. But Yeltsin basically was delivering Russia to, you know, the neoliberals, the Western investors, the oligarchs. Russia descended from within the space of a decade, you know, from a superpower to basically a third world country with life expectancy falling, the standard of living, deindustrialization, the crime, suicide, all sorts of things. It was just on an incredible nihilistic slide downward and looting. Yes. And Putin, when he came in, he, you know, and the Chechnya thing was sort of just, you know, just another piece of the disintegration. And that was a strong issue that Putin could show that he was going to restore the dignity of Russia, and that he would do whatever it took, and that, you know, he turned the situation around when he when he dealt with the oligarchs who owned the natural resources and they owned television stations and they ran political parties, you know, and some of them, I don't know how many, but I know some of them went to Israel to seek refuge so they couldn't be prosecuted. Mm-hmm. You know, you had all that because the link with the mafia has a very strong Jewish link, yes. And the oligarchs and the political parties and the media and all these things. And so Putin was this man who actually did turn Russia around, restored its dignity on the world stage, and that's really what I think, you know, the Western media, who are related to a lot of these oligarchs, carry this resentment against Putin, saying he's fighting down democracy and you know, against free market and all these ideological covers for defending their ethnic kinsmen. But that's my understanding of the situation and the genesis of the modern problem, the contemporary problem. What do you think of that interpretation?
I think it's a largely correct one. I would just say that besides the Jewish Zionist link, under Yeltsin, humongous resources were basically gifted to the West, right. Be it in terms of money or natural resources or precious metals, you name it.
Yeah.
One of the things that Putin did, I should tell you, by the way, Putin ideologically is very much, and to my regret, a liberal. He's for liberal market and capitalism.
Yeah.
And he did not install anything close to anything resembling socialism. Mm-hmm. All he did is tell the oligarchs, okay, the big ones, stop intervening in politics or else. And everybody else who get the message, stop robbing the country blind. You still get to, you know, pocket millions, but not in a way that's going to destroy the nation.
Yeah.
So the outflow of resources was stopped, which was also another reason that got a lot of people angry. I mean, Bill Browder, I will name him, but there are other, you know, this is a typical thing, is that the West could plunder Russia for a decade.
Yeah.
Basically with the collaboration of the Russian government in place.
Yeah.
Putin put a stop to that, and that elicited hatred. And finally, I think what most elicited hatred from the West is that Putin was the first man to openly denounce, the first major head of state that openly denounced the Western ideology, behavior, hypocrisy, and imperialism.
Yeah.
And that coming from Iran was bad enough.
Yeah.
But coming from a country populated by people who at least look European externally, I don't think Russians are culturally European, but geographically they certainly are. That's a big problem, and Russia has never stopped.
Mm-hmm.
And even the Chinese, who dwarf Russia, and the Chinese economy dwarfs Russia by any measure, they don't as openly. There's no equivalent of the speech that Putin gave to the UN a couple of years ago, or the famous 2007 speech.
Absolutely.
In Munich. So Putin not only did he stop that outflow of resources, but he said no, and overtly said no. You will not treat us as your subordinates, and we reject your values. And that, I think, is even another major reason.
Absolutely, and the fact that, I mean, because Russia has the military, resources and has devoted itself to that, it's Russia is explicitly playing a role in reshaping the international, global, political, military balance in a way that no other country is doing. And I mean, it's being projected in Western media as that is some sort of imperialism, when in fact it's the exact opposite. It's about respecting sovereignty and
sovereignty. Yes, it is about sovereignism, if I can say that. I wouldn't say that Russia is the biggest, because China does the same thing, but in a very different way.
Yes.
The Chinese use their own skills, their own assets, their own resources. But basically, they are building a separate economy in Asia. I mean, what Xi Jinping and Putin are doing is not proactively bringing down the Western Anglo-Zionist empire. They're just building a parallel alternative and letting the empire collapse upon itself.
Right.
That is their strategy.
And I think there's one more aspect of Putin's of I don't know if to call it Putinism, but certainly
I think we can speak of that. Yes.
Yeah. One aspect of that we have to also put into the historical perspective that I think most people in the West have no idea about, and that is the idea of Moscow as the third Rome. I'd like you to elaborate on that for me as well, because my understanding of it is that after the fall of Constantinople, then I don't know if there was an intermediate stage, but Moscow then became the sort of center for the Orthodox faith in the world, and that's when the idea of the third Rome came about. If I have it wrong, could you please straighten me out on my understanding there?
No, you have it right, but I would say it's a very complex topic, because its roots are in specific Christian eschatology, specifically some writings of St. Paul. Basically, I would say that the scripture says that there will always be somebody who will restrain, who will hold, who will prevent evil from having free reign on the planet. And the idea is that it's the Orthodox emperor. So the first one, obviously, is when Rome was still, not Latin Christianity, but the original Christianity of the first centuries. Rome was the center of the Roman Empire was a Christian Orthodox empire, if you want.
Yeah.
When Rome fell under the Franks and eventually left completely, both in terms of dogma and in terms of even praxis of Christian traditions, the logical successor was indeed Constantinople. And when Constantinople fell 1,000 years after Rome fell, so there was 1,000 years of Roman history that most people in the West are unaware of.
Absolutely.
And the people in Constantinople didn't call themselves Greeks, by the way. They called themselves Romans,
mm-hmm.
as opposed to the French, who are, the Franks, the Latins.
Yeah.
When they were eventually taken over by the Ottoman Empire, that's when a number of people in Russia said, particularly one author said that, Moscow is the third Rome and there shall be no fourth. But I want to just add a caveat here. If we accept that theological interpretation, as I do, then you have to understand that Putin is not an Orthodox emperor. And the prophecy says there shall be no fourth. So Moscow today cannot claim to be a third Rome because modern Moscow has lost the continuity to the previous third Rome that Moscow was until 1917. The Orthodox emperor was murdered, and there is no other Orthodox emperor.
Right.
So a political leader does not qualify in this quality of the one who restrains.
Right.
So it is an important culture. It's a very important topic, but I'm not sure that it's applicable. Some people do see it as applicable to modern Russia. I think their theology is, shall we say, amateurish or shallow.
Right. Yeah. But one thing I think people don't understand is how important Christianity was for the Russian people.
Yes.
The Orthodox Church was for Russian identity itself, and the violence that the Soviet Union did to that in terms of the massacre of the Tsar and his family, of priests, of the church, and which meant killing the Russian soul under the Soviet Union, and it was hollowed out, and that the Soviet Union was not Russian at all, as Solzhenitsyn himself talked about. And then Putin, and a part of Putin's project was not only about restoring the military or political status of Russia, but its spiritual status and the role of the Orthodox Church in contemporary Russia, and Russia being a Christian society, an explicitly Christian society. I don't think that's appreciated at all, and how important that is. People are thinking of Russia as communist totalitarian. It just really shows how little they understand of the situation. That's the way I understand it. Am I right?
Well, I am a little bit more cautious here in the sense that I think that is part of the dynamic, but Russia is a moving project right now. It's a moving target. It's a project more. As of now, most Russians are not very religious. That's a fact. And it's a fact that shouldn't be ignored.
Right.
However, they're also not hostile, and they're seeking their roots. They are trying to find the way back to what would be a traditional form of Russian Orthodoxy. It is made very difficult by the fact that they have this terrible gap of over 7 decades of militant atheism.
Yes.
And not helped by the fact that a lot of the current Russian Orthodox Church, sometimes called the Moscow Patriarchate, is a direct descendant of that faction of the church which agreed to collaborate with the Soviet regime. Which doesn't mean that they're still doing it today. It just means that these people are of, how shall I put it, flexible morality very often. At least the bishops certainly are, at least the old generation. And they're trying to recreate something. But you mentioned Solzhenitsyn. I think his estimate was that it would take 200 years for Russia to recover from the devastating effects of the Soviet period. And I think it's true. So it's headed there. It is a very important topic, yes. But I would not say that Russia, as of now, is a country with profound Christian spirituality. Just turn on Russian TV and look at the advertisements you see there. It's revolting. If you look at the kind of mercantile, ugly thug capitalism that still exists in many, many segments of the Russian economy, Russia still has, the people who are in power today, they were formed in the 80s or the 90s.
Yeah.
So Russia is suffering from tremendous internal problems, tremendous internal contradictions, and it's too early to call. I'm not saying it won't happen. I'm saying right now there are so many inherited problems and contradictions that it's too early to call it.
Right. I want to bring the conversation to another topic that's relevant to me, particularly here. I'm broadcasting from Trinidad and Tobago, and we're just 7 miles away from Venezuela. And we receive the most amount of Venezuelan refugees per capita in the world. And we've had a long experience with Venezuelan instability. And this wave of migration is something else. And the whole coup process has divided the country in a lot of ways. We're not going to get into civil war over it, but but there are strong opinions as to what we should do. And although historically our position has been one of neutrality, let's say even towards Cuba, towards China, and this sort of thing, that's kind of waned over the years, and so people, many people are just saying, listen, you cannot oppose the United States, and so we should support Guaido, but the government officially is staying neutral. Thank God for that. But now, when the reports were that the Russian military were in were in Venezuela, and also that apparently some Russian military planes landed in our airport en route to Venezuela, people were like panicked because there's this idea of the Russian bogey, that the Russians are evil. It's like James Bond movies. It's and when I try to speak to my fellow citizens about this, it's like speaking to a wall. They just they are just so indoctrinated by James Bond movies and CNN and all these things, and that Russia is evil. And it made me think about the idea of Russia's soft power, which it has. There's a real deficit there. Let me put it that way. Whereas, America and Britain, they have all their cultural things. And because we're an English-speaking, a former British colony, therefore English-speaking, we absorb all the English stuff and all their prejudices. But certainly, that's a big handicap that Russia has, because just the name Russia is equated with evil for people who they're not analysts. They're just normal people going about their business. They watch TV, they go to the movies. So I'm not going to blame them as such, but there's this deficit of Russian soft power there. And I think that, that really affects its moves in places like Venezuela. What's your commentary on that?
Well, first of all, I would say that, for a while in my life, I read the Soviet press for a living as an analyst. And I am intimately familiar with what the Soviet propaganda looked like, and it's nothing like in the West. It was much more honest, much more credible, much more interesting, much more diverse. I mean, it's a disgrace. The Western propaganda machine, first of all, is much more effective than the Soviet one. And secondly, it has been developed. See, keep in mind that, again, modern Russia, you can sort of say, began by 2000 when Putin came to power, or just after or before that a little bit. The Western propaganda machine has been developed at least since the beginning of the 20th century, and very effectively. This tool has been honed to perfection. I mean, and the fact that most of your fellow Tobagons or Trinidadians think that Russians are James Bond and have all those cliches is a testimony to that. Mm-hmm. And what can Russia oppose? RT and Sputnik. Well, first of all, they have much less access. Secondly, I can tell you for a fact that even on RT and Sputnik, there are all sorts of flavors and all sorts of people with different point of views.
Yeah.
So it's not that simple. The main enemy in Russia is internal. It's a traditional Russian curse. Russians are good at dealing with foreign enemies, and they're terrible in dealing with their internal enemies. And these enemies are very real. There's a lot of people who hate Putin. There's a lot of people who would want things to go very differently, and they have a lot of money and a lot of influence, and they still sit in all the key positions. So the people that are trying to create a counter narrative and develop an original worldview and a program that you could show the world and say that what we stand for, are hindered by the people who prevent them from doing that. And still today in Russia, the discussion is, what are true Russian values, and people disagree. So it's much harder for a country who's just come out of really, it's been now 20 years, that's very short in the history of the country, who just came out of an apocalypse and almost died, to develop a counter-propaganda machine as effective as the Western one is very difficult and takes tremendous resources. Yeah. And I think RT did a very good job still, considering the resources and the time left with. Look how they're freaking out everybody, and they're being banned.
Yeah.
Because they can't tolerate RT. And I don't know how it is in Trinidad, but here in the United States, if you go to a hotel and you look at the cable subscription in a hotel, RT is not going to be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's just not going to be there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we do have it on our cable TV, but it's not it's not looked at very very widely by people, but politically minded people will take a look at it. But you know what I think is important in terms of all of this, the BRICS. Right now, that it's kind of fallen apart a bit. It doesn't have the same momentum it had about 10 years ago. Although the Belt and Road Initiative, which has taken off from it, that has built on it. I think that that would be something important for Russia to have a more leading role in, as a partner with developing countries like ourselves who are critical of the IMF, of the World Bank, of the development policies that have impoverished us and continue to impoverish us, and that this new world order that's being built, starting out of the BRICS and developing into the Belt and Road Initiative, I really think that is that's something that's very important that China has been taking the lead on. But I'm not sure. I mean, Russia's participated in it very enthusiastically, but I don't see them pushing it in the same way. Is it that? Why would you say that is? Do they not see it in this with the same strategic importance that perhaps I might see it in?
Well, there are many things overlapping issues here. One of them is that in China, the entire business world, the business community, is basically subordinated to the state. The state gives them, they don't micromanage them, but they give them strategic goes and don't goes, do's and don't do's. So China has first of all, it's a much bigger economic power. And secondly, it's a much more focused one. In Russia, the problem here again, we're always coming back to the what's called sometimes fifth columnist, etc. If you look, for instance, at the Medvedyev government, the entire so-called economic bloc, which are the main ministers dealing with economy, are all IMF, World Bank types. All of them. You're not going to get from them what you're going to get out of the Chinese because their worldview is different. They don't want any. They don't want any part of that. They will go for a quick buck, but they will prevent Russia from fully acting on that. Yeah. Now, the other people that I refer to them as Eurasian sovereignists understand that very well. And truly, in spite of that economic bloc, Russia and China have made something quite unique in history. It's not a formal alliance, but it's essentially a symbiosis.
Yep.
Because China is crucially dependent on Russia for a number of things. First and foremost, energy and high tech, including military high tech. The Chinese still are not even close to Russia in terms of, for instance, building engines, which is one of the most important things for military air power. The engine is probably the most important part of any military aircraft. And the Russians can do it, the Chinese can't. And there are many other examples of that. So what is happening now is China does most of the heavy lifting in terms of economy, in terms of markets and all of that. Russia has this internal fight between the two groups who have different views on what should be going on. And Russia, where she can be strong, does help China. Yeah. And it's for arms sales, it's energy, and it's basically, if you want, Russia will be the policeman that's going to police the one belt. Yeah. Because the security along that road depends on Russia. No other countries have the means, and you can bet that the only country that has enough military muscle and intelligence, etc., get a strategic power to protect that project is Russia. The Chinese know that very well.
Yeah.
So it's a symbiosis, really. I think the two are fundamentally dependent on each other. It's a very daring thing to do. It's never been done, to my knowledge, in the past. No formal alliance, two separate empires, no mutual obligations, but essentially symbiosis.
Yeah.
It's something very new.
Yeah, and I think it's really it's reshaping the world. And I mean, Western propaganda, they are really trying to undermine it, to break it apart. I mean, I mean, even though our government in Trinidad and Tobago, for example, has signed on to it, so many people are skeptical about it, and and they're even though I keep trying to place it in the context that it's part of the whole process of us seeking a new international economic order since the 70s, because the way the world system has been set up, it's we will always be exploited in it. and this is a whole new paradigm. And but I really think that it's important for this. I guess it's coalescing. It's a great way to bring all these strands together into one sort of major project. Because what's really happening? This is an amazing point in world history. It's really reorienting, the pattern of the past 500 years. I mean, it's an entirely new system that's emerging in the world. Yeah, do you agree?
Yes, yes, very much so. And the way it goes about it is amazing. I mean, you have the Islamic Republic of Iran, the officially communist China, and liberal capitalist Russia actually totally agreeing with each other and working together with a clear understanding that there is no single model.
Yeah.
I mean, the advantage of that model is it says that every country has its own historical development, and relations between countries should be ruled by international law, where all countries are basically completely sovereign. So the fact that neither Russia or China attempts to create satellites, for instance, is very typical. Gives them tremendous flexibility, because it gives all other countries the option to choose and pick what they want and to participate only if it's in their interest, rather than being pressured by some bully who tells you, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to bomb you.
That's right. Yeah, I think it's such an important project that still needs articulation. It's there, all the pieces are there, everything is there, but I don't think it's been ideologically pieced together as yet. And I think when it does, it will be extremely powerful. This is epoch-changing stuff. That's what it is.
I agree.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Now, I know we've been talking a while, and I can keep you here for hours, but let me try to bring our conversation to a close. I mean, you write so prolifically on so many topics, but in some, what would you say is your main message that you want to put out to the world?
Oh, if it had to be a simple one, imperialism does not work.
Right.
Simply, the people who get hurt are the host countries of the empire.
Right.
And it's time that these ideas, be ditched. Because really, we've tried it many, many times under various ideologies in different countries, and at every time it ends up in disaster and violence and poverty.
Right.
So I think this would be the core.
And I mean, you've been, you've spoken about your sort of opposition to imperialism and evil in the world. And what really gives you your strength and your inspiration for that? Because I mean, doing what you've done, you've been blacklisted, you've lost your employment, and a lot of people that would defeat them, but you overcame that. And I think that's important for people to understand. What gives you that personal strength to overcome those challenges?
Oh, definitely my faith.
Right.
The fact that I know that I have to accept the will of God, that I cannot control things. I like to say that Christ never told us to achieve an outcome. All his instructions were activity oriented. Do this, do that. Don't not achieve this or achieve that. So for a real Christian, victory or defeat is irrelevant. What matters is resistance. And that's a very different point of view. I will be defeated. That's okay. But I will not give in.
Right. Excellent. So what would you recommend to a young person listening to this podcast?
Are we talking about somebody in an English-speaking world?
Well, yeah, generally. But you can, if you want to have two different messages.
Expose yourself to first of all, get rid of your TV. Throw it out of you can make a celebration out of it. Instead of making it just a little thing, invite your friends. Put the TV in your garden. If you have a right to a firearm, shoot it, then burn it, then have a party. Get rid of your TV. Completely sever your connection to the corporate media is the very first thing I would recommend. Secondly, get proactive and start making your own list of information sources you trust. Over time, you will know which ones are better, which ones are worst, and build your own information. And absolutely go beyond your country. Try to expose yourself, learn as many languages as you can, expose yourself to as much other thinking as you can, and crucially, always listen to your enemies. They might not be enemies, or you might learn something interesting from them. So if somebody is blacklisted or you're told it's a bad guy, don't go there, go there. This would be my advice.
Right. Well, I know you're so prolific. You have your books, you have your you have your blogs and so forth. Do you have any specific plans for the next, year, 5 years from now? Any projects you're working on?
Well, my main, I was invited to visit your beautiful country, and I hope to be there in December. Sheikh Imran has invited me, and that's a true joy for me. I love the man. And I didn't see much of Trinidad, but what I saw of Tobago, he always speaks about my cherished Tobago. I have to say, this is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen in my life, and the people were absolutely wonderful. I have a beautiful, recollection of my first trip there, and I tremendously look forward to repeating that. And other than that, I will have a book. My third book will be coming out this year.
Excellent. Well, I look forward to that. And I look forward to seeing you in Trinidad. I'm going to be interviewing you at the event. It'll be 2 days before my birthday. So
it won't be mine, but it will be better than a birthday present for me.
Good. All right, well, I want to thank you so much, not only for this interview, but for all the work you've done over the years. You're performing a very important service by countering the warmongering agenda and doing your part to stop the American neocon drive to war. I urge all my listeners to subscribe to your email list, read your columns, visit your website regularly. It's really a treasure trove of essential information that you won't find in the mainstream media. I admire your hard work, the sharing of your unique insights, your dedication and your determination, and I wish you continued success now and for many more years to come. Thanks.
I wish you the same, and thank you so much for all your kind words. I will strive to deserve them.
Thank you. That's all for Independent Thought and Freedom this week. Please join us again next week. And in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like and share this podcast with your friends. Thanks, and bye for now.